They fired me for working 2 jobs, then learned why I was holding everything together. I never thought I'd share this online, but the way it all went down still tightens my chest if I think about it too long, and maybe writing it out is the only way to let it stop living rent-free in my head. This happened a few years ago, back when I still believed that loyalty and quiet competence counted for something in corporate America, back when I thought, if I just kept my head down and did excellent work, eventually someone would notice. I was wrong about that part, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The day everything started unraveling was a Tuesday, which feels important somehow, because nothing dramatic is ever supposed to happen on a Tuesday. I was sitting at my desk in the open plan office, the kind with exposed brick and fake plants meant to signal innovative culture, when my calendar pinged with a meeting I didn't recognize. Mandatory alignment sync, 30 minutes, HR included. I remember frowning at the screen, my stomach doing that small, unpleasant dip it only ever did when something was off. No agenda, no prep notes, just a Zoom link and the name of my director attached like a warning label. Around me, keyboards clacked and someone laughed too loudly near the espresso machine, and I had this surreal sense that the world was about to split in two, with everyone else happily continuing on one side, while I fell through a crack they didn't even notice. I straightened the stack of notebooks on my desk, purely out of nervous habit, and told myself I was being dramatic. I'd just shipped a major project early. I'd covered for 2 teammates out on leave. I'd answered emails at midnight and weekends, and during a vacation I never really took. People like me didn't get ambushed. People like me got thanked. That belief followed me all the way into the meeting, where I smiled politely at familiar faces and waited for someone to explain why HR was there, completely unaware that I was about to learn how quickly a career can be reframed as a misalignment, and how easy it is for a company to erase you while insisting it's nothing personal at all. The meeting started exactly on time, which in hindsight should have been my first real clue, because nothing at that company ever started on time unless it was bad news or a fire drill. My director, Mark, did that careful half-smile he used when delivering layoffs, the one that tried to look compassionate while keeping legal exposure low, and HR chimed in about context and process before anyone actually said why I was there. I remember noticing the beige wall behind them on Zoom, the same neutral background they probably used for dozens of these conversations, and wondering how many lives it had quietly watched implode. They talked for a full 5 minutes without saying my name, using phrases like, "Concerns have been raised," and "We've identified a potential conflict," and I sat there nodding, hands folded, trying to connect dots that didn't want to line up. When Mark finally looked directly at me and said, "We've become aware that you're engaged in outside employment," the word outside hit harder than I expected, like I'd stepped off a curb I didn't see. I didn't deny it, because I wasn't ashamed, and because technically I hadn't done anything wrong. But I did ask what, specifically, the concern was. HR's answer was vague on purpose, something about divided loyalties and company policy, delivered in that calm, rehearsed tone that pretends it's neutral while quietly assigning guilt. I explained slowly and carefully that my second job was nights and weekends in a completely different industry, with no overlap in clients, IP, or hours, and that I disclosed it informally to my manager months earlier when I was drowning and needed extra income to offset a raise that never came. Mark avoided my eyes when I said that. HR asked if I had written approval. I said no one had ever mentioned I needed it. There was a pause, heavy and deliberate, and then the phrase that would echo in my head for weeks. Regardless of intent, this is a violation. It was surreal how quickly the narrative shifted, how 3 years of loyalty and output were flattened into a single policy line item, how the conversation moved straight from explanation to outcome without stopping anywhere that felt like fairness. By the time they told me they were terminating my employment, effective immediately, I felt oddly calm, like my body had decided panic would be a waste of energy, and all I could think was how strange it was that after everything I'd given them, this was the moment they chose to be strict. They gave me exactly 15 minutes to collect my personal belongings, which sounded generous until you realize how much of a life can quietly accumulate around a desk you've occupied for years. An IT guy I barely knew hovered nearby while I unplugged my laptop, his presence framed as support, but feeling more like supervision, and I could feel eyes on me from across the open floor as the news rippled faster than I could walk. No one said anything. A few people looked genuinely sad. A few looked relieved. It wasn't them. And a few stared determinedly at their screens. Like if they didn't acknowledge me, the situation might not be contagious. I slid my notebook into my bag, the one full of half-finished ideas and process notes I'd never had time to formalize, and then hesitated over a framed photo from a team offsite 2 summers earlier, back when we still believed we were building something together. I left it behind, partly because it felt tainted now, and partly because I didn't want to carry the weight of pretending those smiles meant something permanent. As I rode the elevator down with the HR rep, the silence was so thick it felt intentional, like she'd been trained not to offer comfort in case it could be construed as liability. In the lobby, she handed me a printed packet with severance details and COBRA information, her voice softening just enough to signal she was a human too. And then she wished me luck like this was a natural ending rather than a sudden amputation. Outside, the air felt too bright, too alive, and I stood there longer than necessary because I didn't know where to go next. I texted my sister first, then my best friend, keeping it short because I didn't yet have the energy to narrate my own shock. What I didn't do was cry. That came later. At that moment, all I felt was a deep, unsettling clarity, the kind that only arrives when something you thought was stable vanishes and reveals how little protection hard work actually offers. I sat in my car, hands on the steering wheel, and realized the thing that hurt most wasn't losing the job. It was understanding that they'd been watching me struggle for months, knew I was stretched thin enough to take on extra work elsewhere. And instead of asking why or offering support, they'd quietly gathered it all into a case file. That was when I stopped feeling guilty and started feeling angry, because anger, unlike shame, at least gives you something solid to stand on. The first night after I was fired, I didn't sleep, not because I was panicking about money or job prospects, but because my brain kept replaying tiny moments I dismissed while they were happening, stacking them together until a pattern finally emerged. The times my requests for more headcount were noted and then vanished. The way my director had started forwarding my emails to other people without looping me back in. The sudden interest HR took in my calendar, my Slack status, my response times, all framed as wellness check-ins, but now clearly something else. At 3 a.m, sitting on my couch in the glow of my phone, I realized the second job hadn't been the real problem at all. It was just the excuse. I'd become inconvenient. I'd asked too many uncomfortable questions about workload distribution and compensation bands. I'd stopped being endlessly grateful and started being honest. The outside work gave them a clean narrative, one that made me the rule breaker instead of the overworked employee who knew too much about how thin the team really was. By morning, that realization had hardened into something sharp and useful. I updated my resume, not the polite, watered-down version, but the real one, the one that showed exactly how much responsibility I'd been carrying without the title or pay to match it. I also opened my email and saw the first message from my former team, a carefully worded sorry to hear, followed by an immediate question about documentation for a system only I fully understood. I stared at the screen for a long time before closing the laptop. For once, I didn't rush to be helpful. For once, their urgency didn't become my emergency. Instead, I went for a walk, something I hadn't done on a weekday morning in years, and felt the strange, quiet relief of having nowhere I was expected to be. That was when my phone buzzed again, this time with a message from someone at my second job, congratulating me on a recent win and asking if I'd consider taking on more responsibility. I laughed out loud, a short, surprised sound, because the irony was almost too neat. The job that got me fired was the one treating me like a professional, while the job that preached loyalty had disposed of me the moment I became inconvenient. Standing there on the sidewalk, coffee cooling in my hand, I realized I wasn't just between jobs. I was between versions of myself, and the one I was leaving behind suddenly felt very small. 2 days after I was fired, Mark called me. Not emailed, not Slacked, actually called, which told me everything before I even answered, because people like him only picked up the phone when they needed something they couldn't sanitize through a written trail. I let it ring twice, just long enough to remind myself I didn't owe him instant access anymore. Then I answered with a calm, "Hello," like we were old friends catching up. He launched into small talk so stiff it sounded painful, asked how I was holding up, and then pivoted fast into the real reason. There had been some confusion about a scheduled deployment, and could I quickly clarify a few details for the team? I pictured him standing in his glass office, the one with the standing desk and the curated leadership books, trying to sound like a decent person while the systems I'd been managing kept moving forward without me. I told him, gently, that I no longer worked there and that anything I knew was now part of my former role, and he went quiet for a beat like he couldn't believe I'd said it out loud. Then he tried a different angle, saying it would help everyone and that I was the only one who really understood the full picture. He meant it as a compliment, but it landed like an accusation, because if I was the only one who understood it, whose decision was it to keep the team that thin? He offered to pay me for an hour of consulting, like dangling a treat to a dog he just kicked, and I felt the anger rise again, clean and hot. I asked him what my consulting rate would be based on. He said, casually, "Let's keep it reasonable." That one word, reasonable, made something in me click into place, because for 3 years, reasonable had always meant convenient for them and costly for me. I told him my rate was $400 an hour with a 4-hour minimum payable up front, and there was a long pause where I could practically hear him recalculating how much he'd underestimated me. He sputtered that HR would never approve it. I said, "Then I guess you'll figure it out." And before he could respond, I ended the call. My hands were shaking afterward, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of doing something I'd never done at that company, saying no without apologizing. 10 minutes later, a former coworker texted me a screenshot of an internal thread where leadership was scrambling, and under it, one line from Mark stood out like a neon sign. "Does anyone have her personal number?" I stared at it and thought, "You fired me for having another job, but you're fine asking me to work for free now." That was the moment I stopped feeling like a victim of corporate politics and started feeling like someone with leverage. By Friday, the first real consequences hit. And I only know that because my phone started lighting up like a slot machine from numbers I didn't recognize, and because Iris, the one engineer on my old team who'd ever treated me like a human instead of a resource, finally broke the unspoken rule and called me directly. The second I answered, she didn't even say hello, just blurted, "They're freaking out," like she was afraid the words would explode inside her if she held them too long. Apparently, the deployment Mark had waved away as routine was the quarterly security patch cycle tied to a vendor contract, the one with a strict compliance window, the one I'd been warning leadership about for months because it required coordination across 3 departments that never talked unless I forced them into the same room. Without me, the handoffs were chaos. Teams were arguing over ownership. Nobody could find the updated runbook because it lived in a shared drive nobody had access to unless you knew the exact link. And in a cruel little twist, the person who'd been assigned to cover my responsibilities was the same guy who'd complained I was too controlling for insisting on documentation standards. Iris told me he'd tried to run the patch without my pre-check script, triggered a cascade of false positives, and now half the monitoring dashboards were screaming red. "They're saying you didn't leave things in a usable state," she added, her voice tight with guilt like she hated repeating it. That made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly on brand it hurt. For years, they ignored my requests to build redundancy and institutional knowledge. Then the second I was gone, they blamed me for the vacuum they created. I asked Iris if anyone had apologized yet, if anyone had admitted maybe firing the person who built the system 2 days before a compliance deadline was a bad idea. She inhaled sharply and said, "No, but Mark keeps saying you'll come around once you calm down." That one sent a chill through me, because it wasn't just arrogance, it was entitlement, the assumption that my labor was a faucet they could turn back on whenever the pipes burst. I told Iris I was sorry she was stuck in the middle, and I meant it, because she was good and she cared and she didn't deserve to be collateral damage for someone else's ego. Then I told her, calmly, that if they needed me, they could go through HR and my consulting terms stood. Iris went quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice dropped to a whisper. "They're not going through HR," she said. "They're trying to get you to fix it off the books." I stared at the wall in my apartment, feeling something settle into place like a lock clicking shut, and I realized this wasn't going to be a simple fallout. This was going to be a full-blown reckoning, and for the first time in my career, I wasn't the one holding the company together with my bare hands. By Monday morning, the tone shifted from casual desperation to full-blown panic, and even without being inside the company anymore, I could feel it like a pressure change before a storm. My email inbox, which I'd expected to go quiet, instead filled with forwarded chains and quick questions that were anything but, each one carefully worded to sound informal while clearly fishing for free labor. One message actually started with, "Off the record," which would have been funny if it wasn't such a perfect example of how deeply ingrained the exploitation was. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I focused on my other job, the one that had treated my skills like something valuable from day one, and the contrast was jarring. There, when I raised a concern, people listened. When I flagged a risk, it became a shared problem, not a personal failing. Around noon, my phone rang again, this time from HR, and I let it go to voicemail because I already knew what it would say. When I listened later, my guess was almost word for word correct. They framed it as a misunderstanding, said they were open to discussing next steps, and emphasized how much they valued my contributions, all without once acknowledging that they'd fired me without warning over something they'd previously ignored. The subtext was clear. They wanted access without accountability. I drafted a response, deleted it, drafted another, and finally sent a single, polite paragraph stating that any further communication regarding my former responsibilities would need to go through a formal consulting agreement, attached my rate sheet, and wished them the best. Hitting send felt like stepping off a ledge, exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. Less than an hour later, Iris texted me again. this time with a photo of a whiteboard covered in frantic bullet points and arrows, my name circled in red like an incantation. "They're saying the vendor might escalate," she wrote, like legal escalate. I stared at the image and felt a wave of something that surprised me with its intensity. Not triumph, but sadness. None of this had to happen. I'd warned them. I'd asked for help. I'd documented everything they told me not to worry about. And now, instead of admitting they'd made a bad call, they were doubling down, trying to rewrite the story so that the mess was my fault for leaving things too complex. That afternoon, I got an email from a recruiter who'd heard, through a mutual contact, that I was suddenly available. She said my name had come up more than once in conversations about people who quietly keep things running. And I laughed out loud at that phrasing because it was exactly what I'd been doing and exactly why I'd been so easy to discard. As I scheduled a call with her, I realized something important was happening. While my old company was scrambling to survive without me, the rest of the world was still moving, and in it, there were places where my skills wouldn't be treated like a liability to be managed, but an asset worth protecting. The escalation came faster than I expected, which in retrospect should not have surprised me, because companies that make impulsive decisions tend to compound them when pressure hits. On Wednesday afternoon, I received an email marked urgent from the company's legal counsel, copied to HR and Mark, using language so carefully neutral it practically screamed fear. They referenced ongoing operational disruptions, asked me to confirm I hadn't retained any proprietary materials, and then, almost as an afterthought, inquired whether I might be open to a short-term engagement to support continuity. I read it twice, noticing how they avoided the word mistake, avoided the word termination, avoided anything that would require accountability. My first instinct was to reply emotionally, to point out the hypocrisy, to remind them that they'd walked me out without a backward glance. But I didn't. Instead, I forwarded the email to a friend who's an employment attorney and waited. Her response was swift and blunt. Do nothing without a contract, do not explain yourself, and under no circumstances give them free advice. That evening, as if on cue, Mark called again, sounding nothing like the composed leader I remembered. His voice was tight, rushed, and he dropped the pretense entirely, admitting the vendor had formally escalated and that leadership was getting heat from the board. He tried to soften it by saying everyone was stressed, that emotions ran high, that maybe the firing had been handled too quickly, and that line, more than anything else, made my jaw clench. Handled too quickly. Like it was a scheduling error, not a decision that upended my life. I told him I'd seen the legal email and that if they wanted my help, they could have their counsel talk to mine. He went silent, then sighed and said, "You've really thought this through, haven't you?" I almost laughed, because the truth was I hadn't planned any of this. I'd just stopped absorbing consequences that weren't mine. After we hung up, I sat on my couch and felt a strange mix of grief and relief, grieving the version of myself that would have folded immediately, that would have jumped in to save them out of loyalty or fear, and relief that she was gone. Later that night, Iris messaged me one last update. The board had asked for a root cause analysis, and my termination was now officially part of the timeline. Seeing it written out like that, in black and white, felt surreal. For years, my name had only appeared next to deliverables and wins. Now it was attached to failure, not because I caused it, but because removing me exposed it. And in that realization, I felt something shift permanently. A quiet understanding that no amount of overperformance can protect you from a company that sees people as interchangeable parts, and that the only real power comes from knowing when to step back and let a system reveal exactly what it's worth without you. By the end of that week, the narrative inside the company had fully flipped, and I knew this not because anyone officially told me, but because the tone of the messages changed from demanding to deferential in a way that was almost embarrassing to witness. HR sent a follow-up email thanking me for my professionalism. Legal asked for my availability at my convenience. And Mark, who had once lectured me about policy compliance, now signed his messages with, "Really appreciate you," like gratitude could retroactively soften what he'd done. I didn't respond immediately to any of it. I had interviews lined up, real ones, with companies that asked thoughtful questions about how I worked instead of how late I was willing to stay. And each conversation made the previous 3 years feel more absurd in hindsight. One hiring manager even laughed and said, "So you were basically doing 3 jobs." And the casual validation almost made me tear up because it was the first time someone had named it out loud. Meanwhile, Iris kept me loosely informed. Not because I asked, but because she needed someone who understood the magnitude of what was happening. The board had paused all non-essential work. The vendor was threatening penalties. An external consultant had been brought in and promptly asked why a single person had been responsible for so much institutional knowledge. That question, apparently, landed like a grenade in a leadership meeting. I imagined Mark squirming, trying to explain how lean teams and ownership culture had somehow turned into a single point of failure, and I felt no satisfaction in it, just a weary sense of inevitability. On Friday afternoon, legal finally sent over a draft consulting agreement, and when I opened it, I almost laughed at how one-sided it was, full of broad indemnifications and vague scopes that basically asked me to absorb all the risk while fixing their mess. I sent it straight to my lawyer friend, who redlined it into something unrecognizable and told me not to budge. When I returned it, politely but firmly, the response time was under 10 minutes. "We can agree to these revisions," legal wrote, and I stared at the screen for a long moment, realizing how quickly rigidity dissolves when the stakes are high enough. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my balcony watching the city lights flicker on, thinking about how many times I'd compromised myself to be seen as agreeable, how often I'd swallowed discomfort to keep things running smoothly. The irony wasn't lost on me that the first time I truly held my ground, everything shifted. Not because I was louder or crueler, but because I finally refused to carry consequences that didn't belong to me. The consulting agreement was finalized the following Monday, and signing it felt strangely anticlimactic, like closing a door long after the room behind it had already gone quiet. I wasn't riding a high or plotting revenge. I was just tired, the deep kind of tired that comes from years of being hyper-responsible in an environment that quietly feeds on people like that. Still, when I logged into their systems again for the first time, now as an external consultant with a clock running and boundaries enforced, the difference was immediate and almost jarring. Meetings had agendas, decisions were documented, questions were asked instead of assumed. People waited for my answer instead of talking over it. The same leaders who once brushed off my concerns now nodded solemnly and took notes like I was saying something profound, and I hated how validating it felt because it meant the respect had always been conditional. Iris joined one of the calls and sent me a private message that just said, "I'm glad it's you." And that nearly undid me, because she was the reason I agreed to help at all. Over the next few days, I did exactly what the contract outlined and nothing more, walked them through the patching process, explained the dependencies I'd been flagging for years, and watched as the consultant they'd hired independently echoed my warnings, almost word for word. No one apologized. Not really. There were phrases like lessons learned and opportunities for improvement, but no one said, "We were wrong." By Thursday, the immediate crisis was contained, the vendor de-escalated, and the board moved on to the next fire, as boards always do. Mark sent me a Slack message thanking me for stepping up, and I closed it without responding, because I hadn't stepped up, I'd stepped out, and back in on my own terms. When the final invoice was paid, on time and without argument, I felt a surprising sense of closure, not because the money fixed anything, but because it marked the end of my obligation to that chapter of my life. That afternoon, I accepted a full-time offer from another company, one that came with a title that actually matched the work, a salary that didn't require justification, and a manager who asked me, in our first conversation, what support I needed to succeed. As I shut down my laptop at the end of the day, I realized the biggest shift wasn't in how they treated me, but in how I treated myself. I no longer equated endurance with worth. I no longer believed that being indispensable meant being safe. And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something I had to brace myself against. I thought the story would end there, clean and satisfying, with me walking into a better job and my old company quietly absorbing the consequences. But corporate messes don't resolve like movies. They just mutate. 2 weeks into my new role, on a Thursday, I was finally starting to feel settled. I got an email from a name I hadn't seen in a while. Dana, the company's internal investigator. The subject line was, "Request for statement," which is corporate speak for "we're in trouble, and we need you to help us decide who to blame." My stomach did that familiar dip again, but this time I didn't spiral. I just read. Dana's message was polite, formal, and carefully vague, but the key line jumped out. "We are conducting a review related to policy enforcement and recent operational events." Translation, someone had asked why I was fired for a policy violation that seemed to have suddenly appeared only when they needed a reason. And now they were trying to paper the trail before it became a legal problem. Iris had hinted something like this might happen, that the board was angry and the vendor escalation had triggered uncomfortable questions, but seeing it in my inbox made it real. I forwarded it to my lawyer friend again, because I'd learned that the moment you treat these people like friendly ex-coworkers is the moment they use your words against you. She told me I could respond, but only in writing, only with facts, and only without emotion. So that night, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a statement that felt like holding up a mirror to a place I'd spent years trying to survive. I disclosed my outside employment informally to my manager during a period of sustained overtime. I was never told written approval was required. I repeatedly requested cross-training and redundancy for critical processes. Those requests were deprioritized. My termination occurred days before a known compliance window. The company then requested my unpaid support after termination. I declined without a contract. A contract was later executed. No accusations, no adjectives, just chronology and receipts. As I typed, I realized how different it felt to narrate my own story in clean, undeniable facts instead of apologetic explanations. The next day, Dana replied with one line. "Thank you. This is very helpful." Helpful. That word should have made me feel triumphant, but instead it made me feel oddly hollow, because part of me knew what was coming. When companies do internal reviews, they rarely look for truth. They look for the most convenient container to pour the mess into, and I had a sinking suspicion they were about to try turning my firing into a process improvement instead of an act of cowardice. And for the first time, I was ready to not let them rewrite it. The fallout took another week to surface, and when it did, it came sideways, through a former coworker who knew how to read between corporate lines. Iris called me late one evening, voice low like she was afraid the walls might be listening, and told me the internal review had found gaps, which was their way of saying leadership had screwed up but wasn't interested in naming names. My termination, according to the official summary, had been procedurally inconsistent, a phrase so bloodless it almost felt insulting, as if the emotional whiplash of being walked out of a job you gave years to could be reduced to a workflow issue. The policy about outside employment, the one HR had leaned on so heavily, was quietly updated and redistributed company-wide, retroactively framed as something that had always existed, even though half the team swore they'd never seen it before. No one reached out to apologize. No one asked how I'd been affected. Instead, Mark was reassigned to a different group to support growth initiatives, which in corporate terms meant he'd failed upward just enough to be out of the blast radius. When Iris told me that part, I felt a flash of anger so sharp it surprised me, because I told myself I was done caring. But there it was, raw and stubborn. The system had once again protected itself. Still, there were cracks. The consultant they'd hired recommended splitting my former role into 3 positions, citing unsustainable concentration of responsibility. And the board approved it without much debate, which meant someone, somewhere, had finally connected the dots. Iris said my name came up in meetings now in a way that was almost reverent, like a cautionary tale leaders whispered about after hours, and I didn't know how to feel about that either. At my new job, things were steady and respectful and refreshingly boring in the best way, and I caught myself bracing for a shoe that never dropped, waiting for the familiar cycle of praise followed by neglect. It didn't come. Instead, my manager checked in weekly and asked if my workload felt reasonable, a question so simple it nearly made me cry the first time she asked it. That contrast made the truth impossible to ignore. What happened to me wasn't inevitable, it was a choice. And the fact that my old company refused to fully own it didn't make it any less real. It just meant they'd learned the wrong lesson, and I was finally far enough away to stop trying to teach them the right one. I wish I could say I blocked everyone from that old job and moved on like some enlightened adult, but the truth is, I kept one door cracked open, and it wasn't for them, it was for me. Because a part of me still needed to see the ending with my own eyes. That door cracked wider when Julia, my former skip-level manager, the one who always called me solid in that tone people use when they mean useful but not promotable, sent me a LinkedIn message that started with, "Hope you're doing well," and ended with, "Can we talk?" I almost ignored it, because I'd learned that talk usually meant, we need something, but curiosity got me, and if I'm being honest, so did the faint hope that someone was finally going to say the word sorry. We scheduled a 15-minute call that turned into 45, and within 2 minutes, I realized she wasn't calling to apologize. She was calling to confess. She told me the HR investigation had spooked the board, and the board had spooked the executives. And now everyone was quietly trying to retroactively sanitize what happened by saying the decision to terminate me had been recommended by a compliance officer based on precedent. Julia's voice had that strained, brittle quality of someone repeating lines they don't fully believe. I asked her directly if she knew about my second job before HR did. She hesitated, then admitted she did, and that she'd mentioned it in a leadership meeting months earlier when Mark complained I wasn't available enough for last-minute asks. That sentence hit me so hard, I couldn't speak for a second. Not available enough. I'd been on call in all the ways that matter, including emotionally, for years. Julia kept talking, almost rushing now, saying she never thought they'd use it as grounds to fire me, that she assumed they'd just coach me or document it, that she didn't realize Mark was looking for an exit ramp. And then finally, she said the thing I'd been waiting for, but not in the way I expected. I should have protected you. It wasn't a full apology, not really, because she followed it up with explanations about pressure and optics and how leadership is complicated. But hearing those words out loud made something in my chest loosen. I told her calmly that I didn't need protection, I needed honesty. And if she ever had another direct report like me, someone who carries the invisible load, she should remember how easy it is to break people by treating them like infrastructure instead of a person. Julia went quiet, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was small. "They're afraid you're going to sue," she said. "I'm not," I replied, and I meant it. Not because they didn't deserve it, but because my freedom didn't require their punishment anymore. But then I added, because I couldn't help myself, I'm just not going to let them pretend this was a misunderstanding. And that, I think, was the moment she understood that my silence had ended, even if my anger had finally learned to aim. The real ending didn't come with a dramatic confrontation or a public reckoning. It arrived quietly in the form of an all-hands email Iris forwarded me one morning with the subject line redacted, but the implications clear enough. Leadership was announcing a strategic reorganization of our former department, complete with a new emphasis on redundancy, documentation, and work-life balance, the very things I'd been pushing for before I became a problem to solve. My role, or rather the work it encompassed, was officially split into 3 separate positions, each with a narrower scope and a clearer on-call rotation. And as I read the bullet points, I felt a strange mix of vindication and grief. Vindication, because it proved I hadn't been exaggerating or failing to cope. And grief, because it took losing me and nearly breaching compliance for them to do what I'd begged for when it could have saved us all so much pain. Iris told me she was actively interviewing elsewhere now, that watching how easily I'd been discarded had cracked something open for her too, and I encouraged her without hesitation, because loyalty to a place that sees you as expendable is just self-sabotage with better branding. Around that same time, my new manager asked if I'd be interested in mentoring a junior hire who reminded her of me, quiet, capable, and a little too willing to take everything on, and the phrasing made me laugh softly because it felt like a warning wrapped in trust. I agreed, but with boundaries I never would have set before, and as I talked that junior through prioritization and saying no without guilt, I realized I was unlearning years of conditioning in real time. I also stopped checking my old company's LinkedIn page, stopped scanning for updates that might confirm I'd been wronged, because the truth had settled into something calmer and sturdier. What happened to me was not a failure of character or effort, it was a failure of leadership, and no amount of replaying it would change that. One evening, weeks later, I ran into a former executive at a networking event, someone who recognized me and said, with a rueful smile, "You were right about more than we realized." And I thanked him politely without asking what he meant, because I no longer needed the details. As I walked home afterward, the city humming around me, I thought about how close I'd come to internalizing their version of events, how easy it would have been to believe I'd asked for too much or broken some unspoken rule. Instead, I'd walked away with clearer boundaries, a better job, and a story I could finally tell without my voice shaking. And that, I realized, was its own kind of justice, quiet but enduring, the kind that doesn't announce itself but changes how you move through the world forever. The last thing that changed wasn't my job or my bank account or even my confidence. It was the way I listened to myself, the way I learned to trust that small, uneasy feeling I used to ignore whenever something felt off. Months after everything settled, after the dust and the emails and the whispered explanations faded, I found myself sitting in a coffee shop on a weekday afternoon, laptop open, working on something that genuinely excited me, and it hit me how different my body felt. My shoulders weren't permanently tight, my jaw wasn't clenched. I wasn't scanning my phone for emergencies that weren't mine to fix. That constant hum of anxiety I'd mistaken for ambition was gone, and in its place was something quieter and steadier. I still worked hard, but I no longer worked scared. I stopped equating exhaustion with importance. I stopped believing that being needed was the same as being valued. Occasionally, I'd hear through the grapevine that my old company still referenced that situation in leadership trainings, stripped of names and context, turned into a vague lesson about process and communication. And every time I heard that, I felt a brief flicker of irritation followed by relief that I wasn't there to watch them miss the point in real time. The point wasn't policy, it wasn't documentation, it wasn't even redundancy. The point was, what happens when people treat humans like endlessly reusable parts and are shocked when the machine breaks? I never did sue them. I never wrote a public post naming names. What I did instead was tell my story carefully, honestly, to people who needed to hear it, especially other women who'd been taught to earn their place through overextension. And every time someone said, "I thought it was just me," I knew I'd done the right thing by not staying silent. Losing that job felt like failure in the moment, like being rejected by something I'd poured myself into. But standing on the other side of it now, I can see it for what it really was. A forced exit from a system that only worked as long as I kept sacrificing myself to it. They fired me for working 2 jobs, but what they really couldn't tolerate was that I'd finally found value outside their walls. And once you see that clearly, you never unsee it. You just keep walking forward, lighter, wiser, and no longer willing to disappear for anyone else's convenience.